Hey everybody, my name is Ted Forbes. Welcome back to another episode of The Art of Photography. Today we are continuing on in our composition series. Last week we talked about line, and this week we're going to talk about shape. And what's interesting is I think compositional elements being broken down like this aren't discussed in photography in the same way that they are in drawing or painting, because the execution of hand skills isn't something a photographer deals with so much, but there still is equally important in your overall composition. And last week we talked about lines and their use. And today we're talking about shapes. And shapes are a little more obvious because shapes do exist in nature. Right now you're seeing the shape of a human being, or me talking to you. Shapes are pretty easy to execute. But what kinds of techniques go into, kind of exploring more interesting things that you can do with shape? And that's what I want to talk about today. And I've divided this into 7 areas or techniques that I want to talk about according to shape. And your assignment this week, we'll get to that in a second, but it's going to be to do things with all 7 of these. And people have been communicating with these in the Flickr forums, which has been really interesting. And there's a couple threads going on in there right now. And it's pretty cool to see what people are coming up with line. And I expect that to continue with shapes. So you're welcome to participate if you join our group on Flickr. And we'd love to have you. Anyway, the 7 elements I want to talk about that combine to, make up different things that you can do with shape. First one I want to talk about is cropping. And cropping is fairly interesting. You can do this with the camera, with the actual picture. Maybe something's left off. Like obviously there's an implied nature of what's being left out of the image. You see me as the shape of a figure. You assume that I have legs, feet, and hands, even though maybe you can't see them in the composition. But cropping can bring interest into something specific, and cropping is a technique that is difficult to learn sometimes. You can also have cropping that happens in your picture, and maybe you have something in your image that's obstructed by a shelf or a case or through a window or something like that. So you can do in cropping or in image cropping as well. So cropping is a really good technique for that. Another technique I want to talk about is the use of scale. And objects have a size that we're accustomed to, and scale requires having 2 things in your image, one to act as a point of reference. Probably the best way to explain this to you is I did a series of shots a couple years ago where I found some really gigantic, huge sunflowers that were for sale at the grocery store. And I thought, wow, that would make a great picture. And the interest in these is the scale that they were large. When I took a bunch of shots, I had some nice pictures, but I didn't get any sense of that scale of them being big because I had nothing in the image to compare them to. So sometimes it requires having something secondary in the image to imply scale, which is interesting. You can also do this with perspectives too. Things that are closer to the lens appear bigger than things that are further away. When we look at some images in a minute, I'm going to talk about an Eggleston image that does that really well, where you can exaggerate proportion and scale via perspective and where you are in the image and what kind of focal length you're using for your lens. Another technique is fragmentation. For instance, you can take an object and you can divide it up. So maybe you have an apple that's cut into 2 halves or it's split. Sometimes things aren't physically fragmented, but they're fragmented by something else in the picture. Maybe there's a line that cuts through something to divide it. Or maybe there's another subject in the center, so you have kind of a symmetry going on with the ends of whatever that shape or subject is. Another technique that I think is very important is focus. And depending on what kind of focus you're using, you can emphasize things or you can blur things into the background. This is a very obvious technique for photography. It's very unique to photography because it's a natural phenomenon that happens with lenses and with depth of field. You can also play with the focal plane if you're using tilt shift, something like that. But the whole idea is that things that are sharp and in focus in your image have more attention, more emphasis on them than things that are blurred out. So you could use shapes in the background and start to soften them and blur their appearance to make them less prominent in the image. The exciting thing about this, and what's interesting, is I think sometimes this has kind of a psychological impact on the viewer sometimes. You can have things that aren't noticed on first glance, but they're seen, and so maybe on a subconscious level they're picked up on. I think this is really interesting. Another technique to doing this kind of thing is using lighting. Things that are bright in the image obviously have more emphasis generally than things that are dark. And so how your subject is lit and whether the shapes are dark or light, I think that's another thing that you can use to bring emphasis to something or to quiet it down and take it into the background. The last 2 techniques I want to talk about get a little more involved, and we are going to look at some images as we are in all these shows here that we're doing. I think this is really important because they're harder to explain. One is the use of metaphor. So perhaps you have one shape that signifies something else. Complicated shapes, things that are less geometrical, things that aren't just a square, a circle, a box, something like that. Things that are more organic in nature, if you want to compare it to the line episode. These lend themselves to having that kind of metaphor. We're going to look at some Weston images that he would do still lives of things like bell peppers, but they were shot in a way that really kind of brought to mind, like Greek classical sculpture, the human figure, or, some of the great figure drawings of the past masters. And I think that's a really interesting thing when you can use an object and make a metaphor for something else. Then you have people on the other end of the spectrum, like Abelard Morel, who I've talked about a lot on here before. We're going to look at some of his work, where he uses very well thought out metaphors a lot of times by using shape. And we're going to look at some of those in a second. And then finally, the last and the seventh technique I want to talk about here for playing with shape in an image would be implied shape. And much like implied line last time, this is a shape that's not really there. It is implied that it's there. I think some people had some difficulty wrapping their heads around that, so I've tried to pick images that show this a little better. One of the Abelard Morel portraits that I'm going to show you today, a self-portrait, actually is an implied shape. He's not even in the photo at all, but it's a self-portrait, and we're going to look at that in a second. So we're going to do something just a little bit different today as we go through our shape examples. Just to remind you guys again, we are keeping a blog, and I don't have the shape thing up yet, but by the time you're watching this, it will be. And if you want to keep an eye on the blog, what's really useful about this is I'm going to have all of the examples that I'm showing in the videos, and I'm going to have all the content written out. So if this helps you to get a better grasp on some of these compositional aspects we're talking about, and I'm going to actually be adding some of my own images to this as well as we go along, so we can kind of work along and talk about challenges and, expand on these subjects just a little bit and make it less like I'm just here handing you some information. But anyway, once again, if you want to go check out the blog, it is going to be, it's available from the artofphotography.tv from the homepage on our website, but it also has its own URL. It's compositionstudy.com. Today I'm actually going to show you our images using Pinterest, which is kind of one of the new social media things that I really like, and I think it's very underrated. Pinterest kind of came along. I think everybody thought the use was for mainly people who wanted to keep track of things for shopping. But basically, it allows you to create basically bookmarks of images of things you find on the web, which is amazing. And it's also amazing to me, rather than just grabbing something off the web and saving it, this lets you link back to the original source. So not only does it keep a collection of images, it will also give you all your source material too, which is really, really nice. And I actually have a Pinterest account, and this is how I've been working when I do my research for doing these shows, is I'll go through and I'll bookmark images. So for instance, and you can follow me on Pinterest if you want. I'm on here. It's pinterest.com/Ted Forbes, and you can go dig through all the other stuff I have on here as well if you want. I keep everything from inspiration to just any image I want to bookmark. But actually, if I scroll down to the bottom, it allows you to keep collections that they call boards, and you can see these bottom two boards right here: composition line, and here's composition shape. And as we get into next week, you'll see a board for that too. And if you want to get a preview of what we're working on, before I actually show it, this is kind of a fun place to do it. I edit these in and out. But anyway, these are the ones I want to talk about for our show today, which is interesting. Okay, so we're talking about shape versus line, and we're talking about uses of that. And I've got a collection of images I want to kind of quickly go through and talk about. This is the famous William Eggleston tricycle image. And, what's going on here is obviously, the use of scale and perspective. The tricycle is pretty close in the foreground. This is a somewhat wide angle lens, probably 35 millimeters, somewhere in there, and it dwarfs the houses that are in the background, and it gives this tricycle a more bold appearance than it would be if you had shot this more in perspective. And I think this is a really good use of taking a shape and giving emphasis on it, and so the shape being just the shape of a tricycle. Fairly interesting. Some other things I want to show you. These are some classic photos. Edward Weston. It's just some still lives of some bell peppers that he did. And again, these are really wonderful shape studies, and I think Weston was so good at this stuff. I haven't talked a lot about Weston on our show, but Weston was amazing. The use of cropping, really, you don't see much of the plate here. You really don't even see the entire bell pepper, but it's a study in the shape and the contrast areas, in the form and textures you begin to see in these things. He did a lot of still lives like this, and they'd have a real sensual quality, very human in some ways, almost like classical sculpture in their treatment, the lack of color, so you don't see that they're green. I think they're simply amazing. Edward Weston also, and these are figure studies. This is obviously, well, we're assuming it's a nude, but all you see is the legs, and just the treatment of these use of cropping and what you're doing with the light and just creating something aesthetically pleasing and beautiful with just simple shape. I think Weston was a master at that. Here's a landscape Weston did. This is just a sand dune. And again, you don't see sky. There's not particularly a lot of information that tells you this is indeed sand, but there's enough, just the rippling effect, the high contrast, kind of almost the sepia quality of this helps that too a little bit. But anyway, wonderful shape studies from Edward and Weston. Amazing stuff. I think I'll show you a couple more here, and I didn't put these in the blog as much. These are some Keith Carter images that are some of my favorites. I love Keith's work. This is amazing. This is very simple, almost a metaphorical example of what you're seeing in fragmentation as well, with this hand that the thumb is on the ground, but you have this darkly dressed man walking in front of it, which gives it kind of a metaphor in a sense, and then also completes in your mind that shape with a secondary shape, which is the shape and outline of a human being. I think it's just brilliant. This photo is amazing if you ever get to see a print of it. It's fairly large. I think 16 by 20 was closest I saw. This is another Keith Carter image, and I love this one too. And one of the things, I've read interviews with Keith. I have never met him. Even though he's a fellow Texas photographer. And I love this shot. One of the things that it's a reoccurring theme in a lot of Keith Carter's work is this use of spheres or use of globes. And this is just a ball floating in water, but it's in a lake and you see a reflection of the sky. You really can't see the water because there's no shape information. So this kind of plays with your mind just a little bit. The shape of the sphere becomes distorted somewhat. The placement in the image of it being, in the lower third, which is unusual, but still, kind of falling into that. And then the clouds in the background, I think it's just simply brilliant. I love Keith's work. Here's another interesting one. The sphere is in this as well, but in this time it takes the shape of a goldfish bowl, and there's a lot done with the focus areas on this to start to blur out some of the extraneous information, like the predominance of the sofa has a very striking shape in this, and it's blurred out a little bit to soften. Same with the background, and so your point of interest here is really on the older woman and the goldfish bowl, which I think is amazing. A couple other uses. Well, here's another Keith Carter. This is spherical in nature, and it's just it kind of brings alchemy into the picture a little bit, which I think is amazing. And really you have kind of a mock setup of a universe or a solar system at least. This is done by some stuff going on in the background with the what appears to be on a chalkboard, and then the random focus of the globes in front, which I think is cool. And of course the front one is Earth. You can see it looks like South America. That's fairly prominent. What's interesting about this too is there's some shapes, and where you could make the case that they're lines, but there's some question marks that are in chalk on the chalkboard, and people rarely see this the first time in this image. So I think, working with focus and being able to take things in and out of focus, I think is an important technique, because they do ring on a subliminal level, and maybe that's not the first thing you notice in the picture, but I think that's a wonderful use and a wonderful way of doing things. A couple other things I want to show you really quickly. Let's see. We've kind of gone through the Weston. Abelardo Morel, as you guys know, is one of my favorites, and wonderful photographer alive today, working out of Massachusetts. And this is one of his big ones. This is Shadow of a House. And what I love here is using shape is kind of a metaphor in this sense, because you're not seeing the shape of the house. What you're doing is you're seeing the shadow of the house in the driveway or in the yard where he's had his kids not only placed lying, one with the stuffed monkey, but also with the windows that have been cut into the sand or whatever the ground is made of, which there's a certain playful quality to this, and I think the house is taken out of context and that you're only seeing the shadow. And I hate to overanalyze these images because it really takes a lot of the fun out of it, but you get what I'm saying. I mean, solid use of metaphor. I think this is another solid use of metaphor. This is Abelardo Morel as well, and this image is just very simple. It's some light on the side of a pencil that distort the shadow into being really long, and you have juxtaposition and a relationship between these two shapes, one of being an actual pencil and the other being completely distorted and whacked out. But that's where the emphasis of this image is, and you don't recognize what that is at first. And I think that's a very tasteful use of something very simple, which is just a shadow and a pencil. But amazing stuff. A couple Man Ray images. Here's an abstract. And Man Ray was really very interesting at doing stuff like this. Remember the Surrealist movement, a little bit more old school, but, the Surrealist thing that came out of France. And for whatever reason, there's so many things that speak to me on this. I'm not even really sure what it is at first. It looks like a couple lenses and maybe a bottle opener or something, but it's the way they're presented in an abstract way that really kind of, I think, sings and plays to the subconscious more. But a very interesting shape study. And, kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum, this is also Man Ray, and also from the Surrealist/Dadaist movement. And, basically the use of, this is a very famous image, but putting the two black shapes of what are essentially F-holes that you see on musical instruments on this woman's back obviously gives the implication of the communication that the comparison of a cello, which I think is beautiful, and this is one of his famous images. So those are some things to look at. Another great metaphor, I meant to show you this one earlier. Abelardo Morel, again, this is a newer image of his that's in a show right now in New York. This image is titled Paper Self. And what's interesting is it's a self-portrait, and it does look like Morel's profile, but it's done completely with a stack of paper. And if you can't see that, you need to look harder. It's pretty amazing. You see two outlines of the self-portrait here. But anyway, very interesting shape study, I think. You could make the argument for contrast and texture on that as well, which I think is pretty cool. So anyway, that's some uses. Again, if you can go into the Pinterest thing, I've got a couple other Joseph Huffner images that are really nice in here that are basic shape studies as well. But this is all done in Pinterest, and so I can bookmark these, and they also kind of link back to the source, which is nice if you want to. If there was an article or something involved. Just a very simple study. This is almost like Michael Kenna's work in a lot of ways. Beautiful black and white photo of a tree, I assume in water, but with a little small fence in the background, but very minimal in nature. But just some very nice shape studies. Here's another one of a cave on a beach. It's really pretty. And then I'll end with this one because I think it's fairly interesting. This was taken in San Martin in the down Central America vacation resort, and this is the Princess Juliana International Airport. And I don't know if you've ever seen images of this. If you do a quick image search on Google, the runway butts up to the beach, and you get some dangerously low flying planes in here, and it's kind of famous for that. And not that he was the first one to go do this, but his images of these airplanes on this beach is certainly not something that most of us see every day. But you have a huge proportion contrast of something that you don't normally see, of these ginormous planes right over these people. And I love the fact, this is not so much shape related, but it's more texture related, which we haven't done yet, but that Joseph Huffner has like this way of making these planes look like they're just made out of silver. It's really amazing. They're really brought out, particularly with the contrast in the black and white image. Probably some burning and dodging as well, but I think they're just simply beautiful. They look like huge flying tin cans. But anyway, I'm going to keep this stuff on Pinterest, and if you kind of want to see what we're working on for the next episode, you can certainly take a sneak peek in here, because this is how I keep things organized. So anyway, once again, it's pinterest.com/Ted Forbes, and you'll find it. But anyway, that's our section on shape today, and so I encourage everybody, once again, Flickr group is a great place to go, share your images, get feedback. We've had some pretty cool stuff with lines so far, and I've been really impressed with seeing what people have done with taking these assignment categories and, moving forward. So anyway, once again, everybody, this has been The Art of Photography, and thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.